Shira, and thank you for those of you who are joining us today. Good afternoon. My name is Molly de Aguiar. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the president of the Independence Public Media Foundation. We're a pretty new foundation, so for those who might not be familiar with us, we used to be a public television station here in Philadelphia. You may remember WYBE, Channel 35. We sold our broadcast license back to the government in exchange for a one-time payment of about $130 million. And we converted to a private foundation that supports community media and media making across the region. We've been making grants since June of last year, and we've already invested, I'm delighted to say, we've already invested about $17 million in a wide range of media organizations and media projects across the region, including the 4 here with us today. I am really excited to have this conversation with our guests, Duncan, Melissa Beatriz, Bryan Mercer, and Letrell Crittenden. I'm going to ask our guests to introduce themselves in a few minutes, but before I do that, I just wanted to give a little bit of context to this conversation and why we think it's so important. At IPMF, we use this definition of media. I'm going to read it to you. Technologies that are able regularly and reliably to produce, transmit, or preserve meanings across space and time. I'll say that again. Technologies that are able regularly and reliably to produce, transmit, or preserve meanings across space and time. And that definition comes from Nick Coldry, who's a renowned media scholar and a professor at the London School of Economics. And I share it to make this point. When you ask somebody about media and like how they think about media and what their definition is, they often go straight to journalism. They go straight to newspapers, broadcast television, often national broadcast television, or public TV and radio. And part of what we hope to do today is to expand your definition of media and your understanding of it so that you can spot the ways that media intersects with and interacts with the issues that funders care about. Because as funders, when we talk about getting at the root causes of the issues that we care about, media, how people create and share and receive information and how they use that information to make sense of the world is always going to be part of the equation of how of how funders think about their systems. And media is both a root cause and also a part of the solution. So the other point I want you to take away from today is that there are many pathways for funding media and media making. And even if you don't think of yourself as a media funder, our guests here today will show you the breadth of media and media making, what that can and does look like in our region. So with that, let's meet our guests. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'll call on you. If you could just give us your name, your pronouns, and just a little bit of background about each of the organizations that you're representing. And I guess I'll start with you, Bryan, because you're in my top left corner.
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Molly. And great to be here with everyone. I'm Bryan Mercer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm executive director at the Movement Alliance Project. And our work has focused on using media alongside other organizing tactics to bring together communities working across issues. And yeah, I'll pass it on to Melissa.
Thanks, Bryan. I'm Melissa Beatriz. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the co-founders of Presente Media. We're a collective of Latinx filmmakers and journalists who are producing investigative and cinematic stories, really focused on social justice. And I've worked a lot with folks here on the panel, so I'm excited to talk more.
Jaz, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Duncan. I'm the founder and chief storyteller with Love Now Media. We are an empathy-centered production and distribution company. We tell multimedia stories and here lately, we've been thinking of new ways to engage our community around social justice and wellness through mixed media, lesson plans, and other alternative ways of creative storytelling.
Welcome. And Letrell?
Good afternoon. My name is Letrell Crittenden. I am an assistant professor of communication at Thomas Jefferson University, as well as a co-founder and researcher for the Germantown Info Hub. And the Germantown Info Hub essentially is a news project, but our main goal is basically to strengthen the relationship between communities and media, and also the connection that community members have with each other. So in addition to simply doing news, our effort is to make sure that we hold media accountable for how they cover specifically the Germantown neighborhood, and making sure that we provide news and information sharing opportunities for residents in Germantown, not just from us, but amongst each other.
Yeah, that's great. I thank you for that. And, you know, I've got questions that I want to ask you, of course, but I really want to encourage everyone to, I mean, this is a small group. I want to encourage folks to join in the discussion, and if we need to, we can leave time at the end for some Q&A. Bryan, I'm going to start with you. Movement Alliance Project plays a very central role in community organizing and coalition building across an array of issues in the city. And even if there are funders with us today or watching this recording who haven't heard of MAP, your work has probably advanced their goals in some way that maybe they don't realize. And so I want to talk about, could you talk a little bit about your own definition of media and what you really want local philanthropy to understand about media?
Sure. So yeah, media and storytelling, I think, is really at the center of much of our work at MAP and really our history. We used to be known as the Media Mobilizing Project, and really work to tell the experiences and uplift the stories of communities organizing for social justice has continued to be a core to what we do. And I think what you were bringing up, Molly, is just so important, that media is a lot more than NPR or the Inquirer. And I think the experience of the pandemic, before then it was clear, but especially through these times where people are social distancing, where folks are separated, it underscores the importance of how we're using media to connect with each other. Whether that's, you know, internet access for how kids go to school, or how we're talking and doing our work together on Zoom, or just the personal stories that people are sharing on podcasts. And so digital media has been this really kind of democratizing force for information, and essential to like every realm of our lives. But then I think it's important and part of experience and realization from throughout the history of our work, because we started really 2005 or so. You know, YouTube was brand new. I think the promise of digital media and how people connect is really there. But I think there's some very real challenges that we just have to reckon with today. Misinformation around the election kind of underscores some of the challenges that we have. I think even with social media, seeing things like the rising rates of depression amongst young people corresponding with rising use of social media, and that we are in this moment where our viewpoints you know, there's more viewpoints being shared from people than ever before, but then what we end up seeing and what we end up consuming gets mediated by like an algorithm that's deciding what shows up on our timeline, and then polarization happens inside of that. And so I think those dynamics of both this democratizing force, but then these real challenges, just speaks to how media is also just not neutral. That media is fundamentally about power, and it's about how communities and people form identity and form relationships. And so if we want to be using, you know, media for social change, we have to be figuring out how we're working to use media to change outcomes, to change what's happening in people's lives. And that's about who gets to tell their own stories. That's about, you know, how people's stories are told about them. And that's about communities having the power to make sure their voices are heard.
Can you, so that on that last part in particular, where you talk about people, you know, whose voices get heard and people telling their own stories, can you talk about some concrete examples of the ways in which in your work you see media harming communities, but also ways that communities are building power through media?
Yeah, I mean, we're in this project actually for the past year or so that we're now calling the Shift the Narrative project. And that's a partnership we're doing with Free Press, which is nationally based, have been advocating especially around news and journalism access for some time now. And the Mike Center, which is a partnership between Rutgers and Penn, along with community organizations. And this project that we're doing is actually supported by IPMF. And through that project, we're looking at policing and violence and the news and reporting around policing and violence in Philadelphia. And, you know, it's something that has quickly shifted around the pandemic, that has intensified around the pandemic. And through the project, though, we've been tracking the news and stories and seeing, especially for TV news, for TV news media, that the stories were being told and how violence is being discussed really struggles to give a perspective on the underlying causes of violence in our communities. So when we end up telling those stories, like the daily stories of the murder rates that is happening, but then not telling the story of the divestment that's happened from communities, we end up missing something about the types of solutions that are possible. When we tell stories about police brutality and the uprising and response, but we cast those uprisings in either a kind of violent or peaceful protest narrative, we end up losing something about the kind of history of policing that has led to those types of protests and uprisings. And so I think, you know, one of the ways that media can be really harmful is just the frame. What is our starting point for understanding the problems that we're looking at? What is our starting point for the stories that we're telling? And so much and so often the frame is about who gets to tell the story, whose perspective do we hear from?
Can you, so the project that you just outlined with Free Press and Mike, like what is it, what do the activities look like? Like what are you doing on a day-to-day basis to try to make those changes in media? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the really exciting things is just being in conversation with communities on a really day-to-day basis, communities that are struggling with issues around violence in neighborhoods, that are struggling around issues of what policing looks like and organizing and working towards police accountability. I think it's also being able to actually follow and track the news in a way with an eye towards what's the type of solution-oriented journalism that we need to see. And so one of the just exciting things we've been able to start is a real dialogue with the Inquirer, especially after the publication of that Buildings Matter 2 headline that happened during the June uprisings, and really looking at what are going to be practices that actually have accountability to communities in telling these stories. And so, I mean, I think in a lot of ways we're at the start of the project, but we're certainly seeing these opportunities to do things like survey communities about what are the solutions to violence in Philly that they would like to see, and solutions that are based in a framework of investment in communities and not just a framework of kind of more punitive solutions. And so getting the chance to hear those stories and then figure out with the folks directly impacted how those stories get amplified, how those stories get heard.
Melissa, that makes me think of the beautiful documentary that premiered in the Beyond Philly conference that the Landfest Institute is hosting just a couple of hours ago. If anybody here got a chance to see that, there were very specifically some folks in the documentary that talked about police narratives and talked about, quoting anonymous sources. And so I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about Presente's fairly new. If you could talk a little bit about, what compelled you and your co-founders to launch it, and then tell the group here a little bit about the documentary.
Sure. So I'll start with how Presente started. So back in March, I feel like this might be a theme, as COVID-19 started impacting us here. I started to have more conversations with Gabriela and Cristal, just in terms of how could we come together as filmmakers and journalists. We had already worked together in different capacities before, and in the wider media arts community in Philly. So we really felt like, first, stories about Latinx communities and immigrant communities of color weren't really being reported in terms of COVID-19 and the intersections of that. Mainstream media really wasn't comprehensively reporting on COVID-19 and racial data until July. So that kind of catalyzed us partly to come together. We felt like we could really, especially from a local lens, start to report on these stories and have this social justice focus as well. There's also this rich landscape of community media in Philly, and we felt like we could add to it by coming together and really focusing on visual stories with a critical, investigative lens. And shout out to MAP. Like I said, a lot of us have kind of crossed paths in different ways. So they've really been pivotal in terms of how I think of storytelling and using media as a tool for organizing. And so lastly, we really just felt like as artists, we saw that artists and cultural workers were an afterthought in the city, especially at this time of COVID-19. So we felt like it was important to come together as a collective and really start to think about what cultural equity could look like. So that's, the three areas that kind of brought us together. And in terms of the film Beyond, so the Landfest Institute for Journalism commissioned us to produce this documentary. They really wanted this piece to focus on information needs from communities, especially communities who may have been misrepresented in the media before or overlooked. So some of the themes that came up in terms of the stories that we produced were fact-checking and misinformation. This specifically focused on Latinx and immigrant communities in Philly and South Philly in particular. Sensationalism, particularly, like you mentioned, Molly, when reporting on youth who have been tried as adults, for example, and not really looking at the bigger picture and how this might impact youth in their everyday lives. And then digging into the aftermath of stories. And this story really focused on gun violence and disability and how sometimes that aftermath isn't fully reported on in a way that's helpful. So that's a bit of an overview of the documentary, and I think it'll be available for folks to watch, so I can follow up with more information about that. But so far we've gotten good feedback, and I feel like we're really in this moment in journalism where there's this reckoning where systemic change really needs to happen. So I feel like this series can really add to that conversation in terms of framing, like Bryan was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really struck by, and I think maybe even somebody put this in the comments during the screening, that how important it is to follow the story all the way through, right? It's not just the story of kids going to jail. It's not just a story of a young boy being shot, but it's like, sticking with that through their life stories and seeing what happens, and not sensationalizing that, and humanizing it. I just thought it was a really terrific and powerful film, so I thank you for that. And I also thought it was a really clear example of storytelling with a community, not for a community, right? It's very clear that it was, very a nuanced look within those communities. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that concept of making media with community and not for community, and how do we get better at that?
Yeah, that really drives our work. And I think that's also part of why we wanted to come together as a collective, because that's one of our ethics and how we think about media making and journalism. So for us, it's really important to establish connections and trust. And we really push back on this idea that journalism should be extractive, which has been traditionally the case in more mainstream outlets. So yeah, and then our approach is also partly asking folks what stories they want to see. So we have this program called the Encuentro Virtual series, virtual meetups, and it's just a way for community members to get together and share what story ideas they might have. So the first one we had in April, what we heard was that folks wanted to see more stories that took language justice into account, as well as immigrant rights. A big theme, especially with information around COVID, was that information wasn't culturally competently translated into Spanish. Even just basic information about health and where to get care. So that was really helpful to hear, and hopefully it helps open up a bigger conversation about language justice in Philly, which I know is already happening in different areas. But that's part of our approach, just really having that conversation with community members and then producing our stories based on those conversations and the connections we already have. Yeah, and then for us, it's really important to have mentorship opportunities because a lot of us maybe didn't necessarily have that when we were younger. So creating this pipeline of Latinx media makers and other media makers of color.
Can you, Melissa, could you, if there are folks either listening now or watching that aren't familiar with the term language justice, could you explain it, please?
Sure. So it's not fully my area, but I'll try my best. So it's just making sure that language and information is accessible in different languages. So I'll share an example of something I heard on an interview I did with Puentes de Salud, which is a clinic that works with immigrant communities in South Philly. So an example is if a doctor or a hospital has a call line and there are multiple languages available, but the operator only speaks in English, that isn't taking language justice into account, because if the person doesn't speak English, how will they get past that operator? So it's thinking of small tweaks like that would need to be made to make sure that there's actual language justice in services, resources, information.
Thanks, that's helpful. Letrell, I want to talk to you about, you have really deep experience in community-centered journalism. You're a reporter yourself. Your academic work is focused on community-led media. And you're the co-researcher on the Germantown Info Hub, which you shared a little bit about earlier. And that's a really important local model. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the research that led to the hub, and like I asked Bryan earlier, can you give us a sense of the actual work of it? Like, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? What did it take to get it off the ground in case there's a possibility of a Kensington info hub and a West Philly info hub? What would that look like? What kind of work is involved in launching that in other places?
Absolutely, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak about the Info Hub. The Info Hub started as a research project, first led by Andrea Wenzel of Temple University, and then I joined on later. And basically, the initial project was basically to find out what are the information needs in different communities in the Philadelphia area, one of them being Germantown, which is a working class neighborhood in Northwest Philadelphia. And basically what we did was we went out and we did focus groups and asked people what is being served in terms of your information needs and what is not being served. And it's almost cliche because we kind of expected to find out what we did, which is that particularly residents of color felt that their information needs were not being served because when news media arrived, it was very focused on negative occurrences. And then, as has been mentioned, a lot of the relationships between news media and the local community members were completely transactional. They would show up for one thing, but there was no building of relationships. The other part of that, and again, we based it off of focus groups, was we wanted to know what else could be done to really enhance information sharing among community residents. And one of the things that they really emphasized or really felt was that there needed to be a better circulation of information overall, not just news, because I think that, and I'm glad that you mentioned that the first in the introduction, if we're just doing, news is not how everybody gets their information from newspapers. We're talking about Facebook pages, we're talking about in-person communication, we're talking about just calling somebody up or seeing somebody at the grocery store. They felt that that information, broadly speaking, was not crossing paths with each other. So what we devised was this concept of the Germantown Info Hub. And we've defined it many different ways, but ultimately it's a news product that is designed to really connect residents to each other and to also improve the overall flow of information that is pertaining to the Germantown neighborhood. So what we've done in terms of starting that, we actually started off with an advisory group. So we have, and actually we're meeting tonight, and this group is local Germantown residents who basically give us advice on different matters inside of the neighborhood. What are we doing well in terms of our coverage? What aren't we doing well in terms of our coverage? Who aren't we speaking to? And just what types of issues should we cover? And they have been essential in really leading and steering what we decide to cover, and then also just making connections inside of the community. One of the things that we actually found through a lot of our work was that, and again, this is a process, we're still learning, is that when we talk about Germantown, there's actually two Germantowns. There's the more affluent, more West Germantown, which is a little bit more affluent, then there's East Germantown. What we realized through our work is that we needed to do better connections in East Germantown, and that is where we came up with the idea, also with work with Free Press News Voices, taking a community organizing model. We actually have a community organizer whose job is to basically just get an understanding of what's happening in the community and build relationships. Not do journalism, but build those key relationships. And Malaka is our community organizer, and she's done an excellent job in helping us bridge that gap in East Germantown. So having that community organizer has been key. And then also we do have a news staff. We also have a partnership with G-Town Radio, a local, hyper-local radio station. I'm actually on the board of G-Town Radio. So we actually have a website where we produce content, and we also have a radio show that we have launched that is, and that was out of the idea of COVID. The other thing that we do and have historically done is community outreach by tabling, which basically we would just set up in different parts of the community and ask people, what do you really need us to do? What are you feeling in the news? What aren't you feeling? That obviously has shut down. as a result of COVID. So we've actually launched a number of these events that are actually community gatherings online. And I actually jumped ahead. One of the other things that we do is we have community gatherings where we are just simply talking to local residents and inviting them in to have conversations about issues that are impacting the Germantown neighborhood. We've had sessions that related to, and these are things that the community wants to talk about, where it's not things that we're developing. Gun violence, issues related to gentrification. And the most recent one was community members just wanted to know what people were doing about COVID. So we invited all of the different community organizations together, and they just talked about what they were doing in terms of addressing issues and needs surrounding COVID. And that's where, again, it wasn't so much that we took this and wrote a story about it. It was we were allowing community members to communicate with each other so that they could better coordinate their responses to COVID. And that was one of the main things that we did. And the last thing that we also do is we always invite media or engage media. I shouldn't say always, but in many of our events, there are media accountability sessions. What is that? So basically, we have an issue that's pertaining to, for instance, gentrification. What we actually do is we invite local media into the session, and they actually share stories. And the community members have the opportunity to, one, meet those journalists and then give feedback on their stories. And in many cases, that feedback is exactly what journalists need to hear, that you're only interviewing the same 5 people over and over again. You're not dealing or connecting to these parts of the community. So that is really in a crux what we attempt to do. It's not just simply doing stories, and we do stories, but we're also really trying to connect community members to local news media, to allow them to critique local news media, including us, and also just connect those residents to each other. And the last point is that our stories, we basically focus on a lot of profiles, community profiles. And that was one of the things that we heard, is that we just want to know and find positive stories, celebrating lives in Germantown. So a lot of our work, if you go to our page, is exactly that. These are people who are doing things in the community. But we also have a solutions-oriented focus where we tackle problems from a solutions journalism standpoint, where we're not just talking about this is the problem. We're trying to figure out through that orientation, what are potential remedies? What are things that have been done before? If somebody makes a suggestion, this has been done before, this works. This has been done before. We don't know if this is the best approach, so that we're coming up with solutions to issues, as opposed to simply continuing to stereotype the neighborhood in a detrimental way.
I think that, you know, the hub in your name is very apt, right? Like so much of what I heard of what you just said is about your convening power and the way that you build connections and relationships with people in Germantown. Can you talk a little bit? I'm curious to hear more about the media accountability sessions. How do you get journalists there in the first place? I can't imagine that that's necessarily easy, at least in the beginning. What does that look like?
One of the things, again, we've developed partnerships with different media outlets in Philadelphia. WHYY has been very responsive to us. We've also there's a hyper-local news outlet that serves Germantown called The Local. They've participated. And then we've actually had some individuals come from broadcast media. We haven't had buy-in from the entire media landscape, but the idea really is to give these journalists an opportunity to show up and basically meet people and address people. And we've actually, the last event, we actually did have a few more people from local broadcast media. So as we've moved along and have built up a reputation, we actually have been bringing in more journalists to the room. So basically what that entails is that we have an issue that residents want to talk about. And again, one of the issues was related to stories around gentrification, which is a significant topic in Germantown because it is located in areas which are rapidly changing demographically. So we invited reporters from WHYY, Billy Penn, also the East Falls local, which is the local now, and they simply just shared some of their stories. And after they shared their stories, we get into small groups, and community members let people have it. We had a group where they were talking about some of the things that we did, and they're talking about these are things that you do well. These are things that we feel that you can improve. And again, it's been a process of trying to bring on more journalists and more newsrooms. There will probably be a few newsrooms in Philadelphia that will never participate, but we have been able to connect. And the idea simply is not just the critique, but now this person, you know about this person, they have a passion in the issue. You know about this person in the small group, and they have a passion in the issue. And that way you're also expanding the source list, because one of the main critiques in our research has been that they go to the same 4 or 5 people over and over and over again, and that is not a representative picture of the neighborhood. So by bringing in reporters to meet different sources, you're actually providing a grander scale of opportunity for different voices to enter the media landscape.
Yeah, I imagine too that there's also that the learning goes the other way a little bit too, in that community members can understand sort of what the, how how sort of institutional journalism works, and what individual journalists, what sort of, narrow lane sometimes that they have to operate in as well. So yeah, that's really, I've not been to the Germantown Info Hub. I haven't been to those gatherings, but I have been to Free Press's work around that. And it's remarkable how I've probably been to a dozen of them over time. And it's remarkable how consistent community members' responses are, regardless of what town you're in, which is essentially, we respect and appreciate the institution of journalism, but we're really angry at the fact that it doesn't live up to its promise, and that it doesn't, that it focuses on the sensational aspects, and that it doesn't give us solutions, right? So it's pretty remarkable how consistent that is. Do you feel like journalists, do you see a change in the journalists that you're inviting in, or do you see a change in sort of the tone and the tenor of the stories that they're writing?
So in terms of the journalists that we've invited in, our work has had some impact, from the sense that, again, I think that people have been much more responsive to trying to figure out ways to cover Germantown in a much more holistic manner. I will say that one of the concerns, and this is why this work is so important, but getting more voices into these meetings is so important, is that a lot of the people that we had come in were receptive to the idea of learning and changing. So I think one of the great challenges is trying to make sure that we get more buy-in from other actors throughout the media landscape, because I wouldn't say we're preaching to the choir. These are people who certainly know that improvements need to be made. But I do think that one of the things that we are more hopeful as we move forward is bringing in more media into the room, so that we can speak to these issues. But in general, I also would co-sign on the idea that this is a issue that is also impacting newsrooms throughout the nation. We have also done additional research in the Chicagoland area, where we've done the same focus groups and the same concerns over media have taken place, and also Central Pennsylvania. And actually, we are planning to launch a second project in a small town called Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, which has different demographics, different politics, but it's the same core issue. Communities are not being served, and they're not having a connection to media. So I think that that is something that is also a major factor in what we've been doing. Is not just what we've seen in Philadelphia, but what we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, for sure. Joz, I want to get you in here too. I'm so glad you're here with us today. I think your work is needed more than ever. And was wondering if you could share the story of Love Now Media and how you think about media for justice, justice and wellness. And could you just share some examples of your work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here with so many of my colleagues whose work I know, and I've kind of worked with some of you all as well. So this is really great to be here. So I am a documentary filmmaker and a storyteller. My work is deeply rooted in communities, and I like to think that I'm a listener in order to be a good storyteller. And so prior to starting Love Now Media in 2016, I had a nonprofit called Griot Works. And through Griot Works, I was really working to be a documentarian and media maker for communities that didn't have the attention of mainstream media and of, kind of some of the larger news outlets. So I was showing up at rallies and protests and where people were organizing, mostly on behalf of Black people and Black communities. And so I found that when the Black Lives Matter movement really started, I was showing up with my camera, working to put out a lot of stories that community members are actually using in like courtrooms and, to share with their like smaller groups or communities. There's a case, Aguiar Sabor, who was beaten in West Philly by police officers. I put together a piece on that was actually used in the courtroom. And so I really became committed to being like this Black storytelling arm for communities. But I found that during Black Lives Matter, my own sense of wellness was really I lost touch with myself and my inspiration. I found that I was like pretty depressed and unmotivated, not really as interested in showing up to document the massive number of rallies and like die-ins and some of the things that were happening. I just really lost my motivation for it. And so I decided that I would kind of just stop doing that work. I felt like it was kind of going in a direction and I couldn't really figure out how to best capture the story. So there was a woman, most of you know, Tarana Burke, who is the founder of the Me Too movement. She's a friend and colleague of mine who was living in Philadelphia at the time. And she organized a rally for Black girls. There were missing girls, Black girls in Nigeria. And I said, well, I kind of got to show up because this is my friend. And folks were used to me coming out to make these short videos and documentaries. And that day, I saw something that was different. I saw fathers holding their daughters. I saw people holding hands. When there were people who were like pumping their fists with one hand, they were like holding each other's hands with the other hands. And I started to capture those moments and something in me shifted. I realized that for people to organize, for people to protest, for people to really be activists and to advocate for social justice, they needed each other and no one was really capturing those stories. And so I quit Griot Works. I didn't shut it down, pushed it, someone else took over it and did what they wanted to do. But I took a hiatus from media making and really did my own wellness work, like thought about what motivated me to be a part of the movement, to dismantle racism, to advocate for social justice. And I said, well, what if I just explore love? And so that was how Love Now Media started. I just started showing up to protests and to events, looking for love, literally. And I became super inspired, motivated to do my work. And I started talking to people who were engaging in acts of love or organizing and just got their stories. And so Love Now Media really started with 4 short documentaries that I put up and started to engage people in conversations around racial justice. There's one story of a young woman who went through the criminal justice system and she ended up becoming like a theater artist. So, getting her story of self-love. Another couple bought just land in Philadelphia, and they started growing food and giving food away. And they built their house on the land. For me, that was love. And so when I started to tell people I've started this new organization, Love Now Media, most people thought, oh, well, you know, my parents are in love, or I know of a couple that is on my block, you know, in love. And I'm thinking, you know, how do I explain to folks that this is a love that is really about community and the community's voice? And so I started to show up in communities with a camera and a bunch of questions on a card. If any of you have ever received my business cards, they have different questions on the back of every card. And all of those questions are about love. So it's simple questions like, how did you learn to love? And you'd be surprised at what happens if you get 5 people in a room and you ask them all, how did you learn to love? Stories unfold. And so I started doing this with a camera, and I called that Love on Location. So I would go to little events, go to Love Park, go to City Hall, and just start asking people the same question about love. And I found that there was this ability to not only bring people together, but to listen to what it was that people were dealing with. And so then I started something called 11 Days of Love Stories, where for 11 days in June or July, it's happened in both months, I would coordinate events where we would do a love storytelling workshop and either watch some of the media or just have a discussion. So I built out a love storytelling workshop where they're basically writing prompts, and we go through the prompts together so that folks feel comfortable kind of figuring out how to navigate their stories. And so these workshops are for the whole community. Folks don't have to be writers or professional storytellers or anything like that. They can just come and they get this template where they're prompted to kind of answer, you know, everything from, you know, how did you learn to love, to, you know, when did you feel most loved, to who tried to love you. And things like that would open up some disappointments. And what I found was that through doing these workshops in different communities, every day for 11 days, I had people coming back 3 and 4 days, you know, because they discovered something that they didn't realize in the workshop the day before. And I gained all of this access to community concerns, to disappointments. There were people who had been through so many situations and no one had ever asked them or created a space for them to heal. And so through my work, I realized that a lot of Philadelphia is operating in a state of trauma. And I feel like these days in 2020, with everything that has gone on, a lot of people are beginning to realize that love, empathy, wellness, it needs to be a part of the conversation that's happening around social justice. And so I think through love stories, I have found a way to stay in touch with communities, to listen to them, and to hopefully create, you know, documents that help people navigate ways to stay well and stay whole and to keep speaking up.
That's, thank you for that. That was really, I learned a lot there. Have you found in those workshops and just as you're showing up in community, what have you been surprised by, or maybe not surprised by? Like, what were your expectations going in, and what did you find, and how do we, I guess the question I'm sort of struggling to articulate is, like, how do we connect this work with larger media making work, particularly as you pointed out, in a year like this when everybody is really hurting?
Yeah, I think that's something I continue to explore. I mean, I work at Word Radio right now, which is, you know, Pennsylvania's Black talk radio station. We're always talking about love on air because of me. You know, I'm like, we got to do vignettes. We have to open up spaces for people to talk about what's happening. And I realized that if you create the space for people to really talk about who they are and what they're navigating within themselves, new things kind of unfold. I feel like we have this language, this kind of social justice language. They're like keywords, they're key objectives, They're, just these common missions that so many of us use, different kinds of justice, economic justice. We got social change. Today I did learn language justice, which is a new one, but, we have so many different kinds of justice, and we learn about these things, and we advocate, for them collectively. But I feel like the question that I'm asking is, where are you in all of this? And for me, my hope is that in asking those questions, people can keep their momentum, their humanity, their human momentum to keep doing the work, because it is exhausting. And so when thinking about how these stories fit into the broader media landscape, I mean, my hope is really that people look to Love Now Media as a resource for ways to refuel and to remain inspired through the stories we're telling. The documentary films that we're releasing, they're all about people who are really doing social justice work, but they're finding unique entry points that feel really human. And I feel like they model ways of staying well and creating wellness within a community while doing that work. One of the chances we took this spring, this summer rather, instead of doing our 11 Days of Love stories, because of course, COVID, my team and I decided we would come up with lesson plans. And it's like, well, how are lesson plans? How is that media? It's like, and what I did was I called on what I call lovers, healers, artists, and activists. And I said, listen, you're an expert. You're an expert on love. What can you teach the community? And we had 14 people come up with lesson plans. And one of the most surprising things was that a lot of people didn't feel like they were experts in love or even in what they did. But by participating in a project where they got to put what they had to offer and what they had to teach a community of people who were hurting and really looking for ways to connect, they felt empowered. And so for me, this idea that I could create something like a lesson plan, maybe even as a form of media, like this is something that I'm thinking about. How can these lesson plans be used to create like a discourse on love? So if you have a lesson on love, which is like consent with love or mothering with love or journaling with love, or, how do you connect to new communities with love? How do you even enter a community whose story you want to tell with love? For me, I'm just inspired by all the nuances that exist under this umbrella of love. And I think one of the other things I'm surprised by is the importance of the now in Love Now Media. So I've talked about love for the last, 3 years, but this year I realized how important the now was when we started to talk about 2020 and everything that has unfolded and that has been revealed in 2020. I'm like, to see love now and to create a document of love right now, it really is going to not only capture the love, but capture the times. And so there's one group, a field hockey and lacrosse group, that I actually did the very first Love Now Media story on. It was really just about the coach and how she helped a lot of the young Black girls on the team to address their trauma through I am affirmations. And she was navigating her own personal life. And that was in 2016. In June of 2016, when Obama was still president, And so I captured her a couple months ago, organizing a march with the same field hockey and lacrosse team. There were girls between 5 and 19 years old who organized a march for Black women and girls. And to see them putting on their lacrosse outfits and going out there with posters and, saying, Black girls matter, and working to get the community's attention. They sat with former Mayor Ed Rendell to learn how to write reform. And for them to be reading, their reforms at their march, that what I got in 2016 was love then, and what I got in 2020 was love now. And so I think what I'm working to do is to create, you know, this continuum of love stories, especially in the city of brotherly love, you know, and sisterly affection, that really speaks to time, intent, advocacy, justice, and also the future. Because I think when I ask people to talk about love, what they end up doing is kind of reframing a lot of the problems. So in a lot of ways, it can operate as kind of like a solution, love, because when you think about, even if there's an absence of love, asking someone what the situation would look like if love existed. What does justice, you know, what if love existed within this situation that is an injustice? What would actually love look like? Then you get people thinking about what they need, and what the community should look like, and what kinds of resources should be present. You know, what does a gentrifying neighborhood look like if love were to come in? You know, like it just really gets people thinking about the future. And I'm hoping that that's what the work does.
Your emphasis on now brings me back to our definition of media that I shared in the beginning, where we talk about preserving meaning over time, over space and time, you know, because we've spent, I think at IPMF, we spent a lot of time this year thinking about what are the stories that are so important to capture in this very unique time. And I hear a lot of echoes of what you're saying about that too. And also, you know, reimagining. And so there are a couple of things I'd really love to like hear from all of you and your perspective on two like big issues in media. One is about how we use media, how people can feel powerful using media. And the other is how we reimagine media that works for everybody. And so I'm wondering, how do I ask those in a question form? Can we, you know, if any of you would like to jump in and just talk about how you think we need to be working, we'll start with reimagining, how we need to be working toward reimagining media, because I hear each of you talking about, you know, community members saying it doesn't work for them, right? What we have now doesn't work for them. And so how do we get to a place where media is a tool for freedom? Who wants to jump in?
I mean, I think there are a couple things. I think we just have to create more spaces to listen to people and to be in community with people. You know, I think, you know, watching the documentary this morning with Presente, that idea of being alongside the voices, I think that's kind of like one of the answers. You know, just really feeling like the people who are making the media are connected and really care about the issues. It's not just filing a story for the day or, you know, or the week. And if there are ways to keep people in communities connected to the community storytellers, I mean, not everybody wants to be a media maker, but you know, if there are more opportunities for folks to sit alongside the community storytellers, you know, so that they're, you know, we can be listening. I think it's just very important to keep those spaces vibrant.
Yeah, I agree. I think Jas's comments are really powerful. And I think the other kind of intervention I would put out, I think about this term, like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? This idea that the type of reporting that we get, where the attention is at the kind of worst ills of our society, are about the violence and hurt and trauma that actually is attention grabbing. And I think we have to also grapple with the financial incentives that happen, the kind of market forces that happen, the structural forces that happen that make that suffering so attention grabbing. And I think one of the real challenges about media ownership and consolidation of media and the way that various voices are excluded is that we get that kind of incentivized model towards if it leads, it bleeds type reporting, and not the incentivizing of the type of love-centered approach that Jas is speaking to. And so I think also, that we need to intervene on the structural level to ask, how are we funding something different? How are we actually resourcing the type of media that can do that? And massive public investment and massive philanthropic investment is going to be an important step.
I would echo those same concerns. And I think that one of the main things that we would need to really transform media, in addition to dealing with the structural issues in terms of financing, but things that can be done right now, and I think that everybody on this call is doing it, is engagement. I think that one of the main problems that has been throughout this conversation is that journalists do not engage communities. And I've said this to different people a number of times, but can you imagine how this past election would have been covered if you had people who represented the communities that were impacted by the presidential election actually inside of newsrooms, or their voices were frequently heard in news media? And I think that one of the reasons that engagement is so important is that I think that a lot of news media, they're not connected to their communities. They may be socially near, but in terms of, physically near, but they're socially distant from the actual communities that they connect with. So really getting in there and engaging and talking to people and building non-extractive relationships. Transactional, that's a step that I really think that a lot of what we do in news media is extractive. We take out and we do not give back. So I think that you really need to start building really strong relationships. And I think that the work that we've been doing, that everybody on this call has been doing, that you can look at Free Press and some of their work, is that they're trying to build up the connection so you build up trust back in communities. Again, even from a financial standpoint, if you're talking about from a marketing standpoint, if you're trying to engage in these different communities and they don't trust the product that you're producing, then you're pretty much wasting your time. And that's one of the other things that engagement is designed to do, is that people will not buy your product in whatever way you want to frame that if you do not tell them or show them that they can trust you. And I think that issue of trust, and that's across the board, we need to build up trust in communities. We need to make sure that different communities see themselves in the reporting staff, whether that's through diversity in hiring or even more first-person narrative storytelling. And we need to make sure that they can feel invested in the media. That is not just coming in, taking out something, and we'll see you 6 months later when we have to do another package on Germantown or diverse communities. It needs to be a genuine connection and relationship.
Yeah, and I would just add to all that, that building off of what you're all saying, for us, arts and culture is really important, and part of Presente's mission to work that into our storytelling. In terms of reimagining media, it's important that our creativity is centered, our movements, joy. That's really, really important for us. And part of reimagining media will also really take this investment from funders for community media projects like all of ours. That's often really long-term work, building on these long-standing relationships. So that investment's really needed in terms of really having sustainability for our work.
Yeah, right. Because just thinking about trust, right? And how long it takes to build trust with communities, and then, how easy it is to break that trust with headlines like buildings matter too, right? So.
Can I just add that I think at times, you know, media can seem, news can seem like this very like elite kind of like ecosystem, you know, where everything is this high level reporting and, you know, only certain people should be allowed, you know, access to the channels. And I recall when I met Sandra Clark over at WHYY and told her about what I had been doing both with GrioWorks and Love Now Media, she actually hired me to do news storytelling workshops in communities. And they took those stories that there were about 20 people at each of those workshops. And this is the same community storytelling approach I did with Love Stories. And I just kind of, you know, switched it so that it was, how would you create your own news stories? And then they worked with some of the people in the workshop to actually publish their stories. And I just thought that was amazing for the folks who went through the workshop and then, you know, kind of had their stories documented and got to work with, I think her name was Jeanette Woods at the time, to have an editor so that it was still good. But it was a real compelling story coming straight from the community. I think there needs to be a lot more of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I agree with you, and I think it's worth pointing out that the two women you mentioned are two Black women, right? They understand the value of that. Bryan, I want to go back to, you talked about media ownership. And I think that's a really big piece of this conversation, right? Is who owns the media and who owns the media, who gets to make the decisions, right? Therefore, who gets hired, and I mean, when we're talking about journalism anyway, who gets hired, who gets to choose which sources. What do we need to be working on around media ownership, and what do we need? These are big questions, I apologize, but what do we need to be working on around media ownership, and what do we need to be working on around media policy?
Those are big questions.
Tell funders what they need to hear.
I'm sure, and I'm sure others on the panel have things to add. I mean, I think part of the work on media ownership is supporting the kind of alternative sources and places mentioned already on this call, like WURD being one of 3 Black-owned radio stations in the country, and like G-Town Radio and WPPM, the radio station from Philly Cam. You know, those radio stations exist because of media advocacy, because of media policy work. In the case of G-Town and WPPM, the low power FM work that really expanded the airwaves so that more new radio stations could come on air in the last decade. So I think initiatives like that are really important to be putting our attention on. I think, you know, we've got to deal with the internet as kind of the central medium of our time for people being connected. And so the fact that the US continues to lag behind on connectivity for every country that is comparable to us is a shame, right? And right here in Philadelphia, with the largest cable company in the country headquartered here, I think we have a kind of hometown responsibility to make sure that our hometown internet provider is actually stepping up to do what they should be doing around the country. I mean, we saw throughout the early days of the pandemic a real set of half steps on the part of Comcast for the type of offers for connectivity to make sure that students, young people could get online, and even still to this day, challenges that families have getting connected through services like Internet Essentials, especially if their English is not their first language, speaking of language justice, especially if they're undocumented, especially if they have other disabilities that are making access through the kind of Internet Essentials pipeline a challenge. And then, I mean, I think as a kind of overall set of issues, you know, something that we should be looking forward to is with a new administration coming in, we should be paying close attention to the FCC again. The FCC of the past 4 years, the Federal Communications Commission of the past 4 years, has released a horrible set of policies to roll back media access, probably the highlight of which being rolling back the Obama era net neutrality policies. That should be something that a new FCC is hearing from communities around the country, that having an open, equitable access to the internet is a foundation to making sure that everyone can get connected.
Anybody else want to add to that before I move on to another question?
I would just add that I think thinking of some of the other work that we've been doing outside of Philadelphia is that the main challenge is how are we going to keep these projects sustainable in the long term? And I think that the foundations can certainly assist with really stabilizing a lot of projects that are out there, especially ones that are coming from the grassroots. I think that one of the things that is exciting about this moment is that there are people who are making media organically all throughout the city and all throughout the nation. And if there's a way to just simply allow them to get started in terms of getting some finances or resources, you can see these projects actually blossoming and growing, and you see that really, especially here in Philadelphia. But I think one of the main issues is going to be how do you keep these projects sustainable? And that's the main debate, is that things can't necessarily only operate through foundation funding. There may need to be more government funding. And then one of the things in terms of location is that one thing that I love about Philadelphia is that there is so much support, but in other locations, you're not going to see that level of potential foundation support. So we need to come up with creative ideas on how to fund different media outside of sort of the Philadelphia area, because they may not have the same access to funding. So I think that I would encourage everybody to look at the work of Victor Picard at Penn, who has been really looking at these issues on how to transform the media landscape and dealing with these different issues in terms of how to really keep everything sustainable. But I think that certainly at the grassroots level, foundations can really energize already existing collaborative projects and really pump them up and really build them up. That's one of the things, for instance, as being with G-Town Radio, we've actually gotten some grant funding, and that's really increased our capacity to serve our community in Germantown.
I second that recommendation about Victor, who's doing really important work talking about reimagining media for the future. I want to just note that Annie has a question here about how community organizations, how can they implement media making in their work? Like when you're thinking in particular about like direct service organizations, do you have advice for those kinds of organizations?
So my advice is to include funds for that in the budget. I think part of the issue is it's not thought of up front. Okay, how can we incorporate media making or hire artists? And stipends end up being very low. So that's one of my recommendations. Really think about how you can hire working artists in the area with equitable rates. And also think more long-term, can you have folks on your staff who are media makers?
Yeah, those are excellent suggestions. I know that just in general, I don't want to conflate media and communications, but in general, I think nonprofits are not as appreciative of the communications aspects of their work and the power to mobilize their audiences through media making. So that's an excellent suggestion. Does anyone have anything else to add there?
I just finding people who are doing the work well, and then I think collaborations during this particular period are very important, because there are certain people who may be align with your mission and they seem to be doing something well, we shouldn't be competing with each other. It should be, oh, you're doing this great. What ideas, what are you doing? Or can you assist with us with X, Y, or Z? And I think that really during the last several months, the idea of collaborating, particularly on communication, has been very key in serving different constituencies during the pandemic. So I think that if you're not doing something well, and that's something that even in media making, you see all the different groups on this call, and a lot of us have collaborated in some way, shape, or form. So I think that that's something that nonprofits should also consider doing.
Yeah, I agree. And for profits. And I think to be able to get funding, collaborative funding is a big deal. I think there are a lot of organizations who, might want to tell stories. I mean, just hearing about LimFest and Presente, I mean, that was like, what was it, underwritten, Melissa? Or, yeah, I mean, if more, nonprofits were co-funded with, media organizations to put out a series of stories. I think that could be another way to really think about funding both, nonprofits and the media organizations, because I think the media organizations are looking to support voices that are, doing good work, and organizations that are doing great work. But if they feel like they have to work inside, the organization, then it kind of takes them away from being able to make the media consistently. So I think thinking of like kind of project-based models where there could be some kind of collaborative funding or underwriting or, something like that could really be helpful.
So we have a few minutes left, and I was hoping I might get a few pieces of advice for any funder that might be viewing this later. What advice you might give to funders who don't think of themselves as media funders, maybe don't currently fund any kind of media, but they know, right? They feel the importance of media, particularly this year, I think has really, raised a lot of awareness about the power of and pervasiveness of media in our lives. What kind of advice would you give to them, and how and where they might get started? Beyond obviously funding each one of your organizations.
Well, I think if we think about, the stories and the impact that stories make, how are stories being captured? So I think, funding storytelling is a way to think about it, and funding change. I think there's also a thing that we do in the film world where we have impact strategies. So sometimes the media is already made, but then there could be additional funding for the filmmakers or the community members to do an impact campaign. So like, where does Beyond go now? Is it just going to go on the internet? Or is there a campaign that pays the filmmakers and the community members to show up and present it and discuss it and ask questions and get more communities' inputs, So I think there are, different layers to funding. It's not just about the media itself, but it's about the stories and the impact the stories will make.
Yeah, I love that so much. I think that's so right on to start in communities and to start at the grassroots. And I feel like this also just may be silly to say, but I think anyone looking to start funding in this field should talk to you, Molly, and the rest of the team at IPMF. I think the research and kind of knowledge of the Philadelphia media landscape and appreciation for kind of the grassroots and community-driven approach is unmatched by a few others. And so they should build a relationship with you. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And we will always, willingly raise our hands to help any funder who's interested and curious and doesn't know where to start. I think, again, it's so easy, I think, for funders who don't fund media and don't think of funding media, it's easy for them to just go straight to the journalism, and you know, media can be libraries, it can be public TV and public radio and journalism. It can be, I made a list of all of the different kinds of media making that that I've been a part of funding over the years, and there are things like comedy shows based on investigative journalism and theatrical plays based on investigative journalism, documentaries, museum exhibits, archives, community archives, right? That's media making. Student reporting projects, text messaging. I funded this really awesome program after Hurricane Sandy using electronic billboards in town to help create, you know, useful information for people in town, in a particular town in New Jersey where, you know, it was like a car culture, right? And people would see on the electronic billboards all the information they needed to know when rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy. Like, there's so many different pathways into media, and I just think it's really important for funders to understand that, but also to understand that it affects their issues, whether they want to acknowledge that or not. It affects their issues, and so we're here to help them think through that. And I think what you've all said today that's been really powerful, and I really appreciate it, is how very important it is to center community in every any organization or project that a funder might consider funding. They need to really examine how rooted in community that work is, if they want it done well, which, you know, I've really heard loud and clear from you today. So I really appreciate that. I think we were basically at time. So I just, you know, I want to thank the Philanthropy Network, and I want to thank the four of you, Bryan, Jaws, Melissa, and Letrell. You've been fantastic for really like illuminating all the different ways that, you know, media impacts our lives. And for those of you who are listening now and watching later, I strongly encourage you to go visit their websites and support their work. And I want to thank my awesome staff at IPMF, who are fantastic. And again, I just want to say we're IPMF staff are here and available as a resource to any funder, you know, who's interested in supporting media. And you can find our emails on our website at independencemedia.org. And we look forward to having more of these conversations about media and media making. And thank you so much to the four of you.
Thank you.